Well, let me start with my favorite philosopher, David Hume, who was notorious for liking paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes that he came across was when he was reflecting on the first principles of government. And what caught his attention was that, I'll quote him, he said, "I find nothing more surprising than to see the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and to observe the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is brought about, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular." That's what I mean by Hume's maxim. And it seems to me reasonably well supported, but does require a qualification. It applies with much greater force to the more free and popular governments as it becomes more difficult to control the population by force. Actually, that was already becoming clear in Hume's day and well before. He was writing a century after the first democratic revolution in England in the 1640s. And at that time, those who described themselves as the men of best quality were appalled as, I'll quote them, "a giddy multitude of beasts in men's shapes rejected the basic framework of the civil conflict that was raging at the time in England between king and parliament. They rejected rule by king or parliament. They called for government by countrymen like ourselves that know our wants, not by knights and gentlemen that make us laws and are chosen for fear and do but oppress us and do not know the people's sores." And the men of best quality were deeply offended by this, naturally. They recognized, as they put it, that if the people are so depraved and corrupt as to confer places of power and trust upon wicked and undeserving men, they forfeit their power in this behalf unto those who are good, though but a few, namely us, the men of best quality. That persists right to the present. Fundamentally, the same principles underlie the U.S. constitutional system. You read the debates in the Constitutional Convention, you see that, quoting Madison, that the system was designed to ensure that power would remain in the hands of what he called the wealth of the nation, those who sympathize with property owners and their rights, and those who understand that a primary goal of government is to protect, to ensure that the majority of the opulent are protected from the majority. This is Madison's explanations during the Constitutional Convention. Actually raised issues that go back to Aristotle, who incidentally took the opposite position, looking at the same dilemmas. Well, that, however, became more difficult over time. I won't run through the history, which you know, and it led to growing concerns. In fact, it was one factor that lay behind what is one of the really great contributions of American society, namely the introduction of mass public education, not without qualifications, which, for example, were noted by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He commented that political leaders call for popular education because they fear that this country is filling up with thousands and millions of voters, and you must educate them to keep them from our throats. But educated the right way, of course. You have to limit their perspectives and understanding. You have to discourage free and independent thought. You have to train them for obedience. You have to have programs like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top and so on, designed for these purposes, very live issues right at the moment. Well, it shouldn't be any surprise that the most sophisticated propaganda systems developed in the most free societies. Actually, that follows from the qualification to Hume's Maxim. The first was Britain, the British Ministry of Information. Of course, they always have good Orwellian titles. The Ministry of Information was, its task was to direct the thought of most of the world. But they didn't care about most of the world. What they cared most about was progressive American intellectuals, like the Dewey Circle. And they had a task too. Their task was to drive a reluctant public to war, and they thought they had achieved this very well. They took great pride in their achievement, in their own words. It's from the New Republic, their main journal. They said the task of the intellectuals which they carried out was to serve as the faithful and helpful interpreters of what seems to be one of the greatest enterprises ever undertaken by an American president. It was, of course, Wilson's decision to enter the European war immediately after campaigning and winning on peace without victory. And the achievement of the intellectuals, as they described it, was to impose their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority, using such devices as fabrications about Hun atrocities that were provided to them by the British Ministry of Information. There were, of course, a few scattered who refused to participate in the great enterprise. So, for example, Randolph Bourne, he was barred from the intellectual journals. Others were jailed, like Bertrand Russell or Eugene Debs here, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, but they're small periphery. Most of the intellectuals lined up enthusiastically in the noble enterprise on all sides, and that's pretty characteristic. Well, Wilson, I'm sure you know, quickly founded his own propaganda agency, another Orwellian title, the Committee on Public Information, called the Creel Commission. And it was very successful. The population had been generally pacifist, but within months they were turned into raving anti-German fanatics. It was quite an impressive achievement. And these grand successes inspired progressive democratic theorists and also the huge public relations industry, which was just beginning to develop at the time. Among the notable members of the Creel Commission were Walter Lippmann, leading public intellectual of the 20th century, the author of what are called progressive essays on democracy, and another was Edward Bernays, one of the founders of the public relations industry. Both of them, incidentally, were, as I'm sure you know, were Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals, you know, on what we call the left end of the spectrum. I won't talk about the right. In his, what are called his progressive essays on democracy, Lippmann drew explicitly, very explicitly, from the achievements of thought control carried out by the Creel Commission. And so did Bernays, referred specifically to these great achievements in what became one of the first manuals of the PR industry. It was called propaganda. That term was then used freely. It took on negative connotations during the Second World War, so now the term's used mostly for propaganda of the enemies. In some languages, there's, like Hebrew, for example, makes a distinction between a word propaganda, which means what those guys do, and the word translates as explanation, which refers to what we do. Since it's so obviously right, all you have to do is explain it. And we have the same usage without the split in terms, so we don't use propaganda for our presentation of our own propaganda. Lippmann and Bernays, and they were, and other prominent figures too, were very much impressed by what they called the engineering of consent. Bernays, a manufacturer of consent, Lippmann, which Lippmann called a new art in democracy. And the goal was the same as the men of best quality in the 17th century. It was necessary to ensure, as they put it, that the intelligent minority, that's the men of best quality, must rule, and not troubled by the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. There's guys out there who are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. They do have a function in a democratic system. It's called a function. Their function is to trample periodically in support of one or another members of the men of best quality, the leadership class. Now, that's what we call an election. The free society needs, I'm quoting still, a mechanism which controls the public mind and enables the intelligent minorities so to mold the mind of the masses that they will throw their newly gained strength in the desired direction in this way. So between educational systems that keep them from our throats and propaganda systems that regiment their minds so that they do the right thing voluntarily, we can perhaps ensure that the men of best quality will be saved from the raging rabble. We have to continue to regiment the public mind, much as an army regiments the body of its soldiers. And this process of engineering of consent is the very essence of democracy, of the democratic process. The same was true in the scholarly world. The term propaganda entered the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1922. One of the leading scholarly figures dealing with propaganda was Harold Lasswell, also liberal progressive. He advocated the sophisticated use of what he called the new technique of control of the general public that was pioneered by Woodrow Wilson, the great generalissimo on the propaganda front. He explained that the public is a threat to order because of the ignorance and superstition of the masses, and we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not the best judges. We are the men of best quality. So we've got to work out, organize the world so that for their own benefit, we rule, just as you don't let a 3-year-old child run into the streets. Couldn't let the masses express their opinion freely or even have an opinion. Again, runs through the educational system, the propaganda system. We don't call it propaganda, and so on. We call it public relations often. And the main function of the public relations industry, of course, is commercial advertising. Extremely successful in the United States. It influenced others. Goebbels, for example, was quite impressed with American commercial advertising and tried to mimic it too successfully, unfortunately. The Bolsheviks also were impressed and tried to mimic it, but very clumsily, so it didn't work, but they weren't sophisticated enough. In the United States and Britain, the main task is what Veblen called fabricating consumers and directing people to the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. Don't mind if you're quoting you, okay? Business leaders. The public relations industry also now pretty much runs elections, and they're very well aware of it. So, for example, as you may recall, after Obama's election in 2008, it happened to be right before the annual meeting of the Professional Society of Advertisers. They give an award every year for the best marketing campaign of the year, and they gave it to Obama. And if you look at the business press, like Financial Times, reports about the reactions of business leaders, are really pretty excited about this. They have a new model for deluding the public, which was just worked out so effectively in the Obama campaign by his PR managers. Running elections is pretty much like commercial advertising. The main function of commercial advertising is to undermine markets. That's transparent. It takes genius not to notice it. anyone who's taken an economics course knows that markets are supposed to be based on informed consumers and making rational choices. And anyone who's turned on a TV set knows that commercial advertising is designed to achieve the opposite effect, to create uninformed consumers who would make irrational choices. If we had market systems, we'd have information presented, but when you can't have allow market systems because of oligopoly and cutting down price wars and so on, then you have to undermine markets, which is the main function of commercial advertising, huge amounts of money every year. And when you move to the political domain, it's essentially the same. The kind of democratic theory you learn in 8th grade civics classes is about informed voters making rational choices, but election campaigns are designed to ensure that you have uninformed consumers making irrational choices, although in a sense rational, because the regimented minds are supposed to be directed in the proper direction by the men of best quality. Well, this usually often works well, but it often does not. And the fact that it doesn't work well is illustrated by an enormous gap across the board, foreign policy, domestic policy, between public opinion and policy on many crucial issues. Fortunately, we're going to be defended from knowing anything about this pretty soon. There's a new amendment, and the Coburn Amendment in Congress states that the NSF can't provide any more support for political science unless the work is designed to improve competitiveness and the economy. So put an end to all of these studies of public opinion and policy with all of their dangerous conclusions. The main conclusions that have come out of quite good recent work on professional political science are people like Martin Gillen's, Larry Bartell, Benjamin Page, and others, is to show that about 70% of the population, the lower 70% on the income scale, are almost completely disenfranchised. Their opinions have no effect on policy. And as you move up the scale, you get greater and greater influence. At the very top, 1/10 of 1%, essentially, you get what you want. There's a recent study by Ben Page and Larry Bartels on one of the issues on the front pages, namely what to do, what about the deficit? And it turns out, predictably, that the higher you go up on the wealth income scale, the more concern there is for the deficit. As you get down to the great mass of the population, the rabble, they're concerned with jobs. They don't care about the deficit, and they're quite right. But the banks want concern about the deficit. The rich want concern about the deficit. So when we have a sequester, it's about the deficit, not about jobs. And policy is just sharply distinct from opinion on this, and also rationality. There's a much more important case, and a very striking one, which may have to do with decent survival of the species. That's environmental disaster. It's built into market systems that you must have environmental catastrophe. Of course, we don't really have a market system, but to the limited extent that we have, it's driving in that direction. And there are huge propaganda campaigns, perfectly public, by Chamber of Commerce, American Petroleum Institute, and so on, to try to convince the population not to worry about it. No, nothing, doesn't matter, because from a business point of view, a destruction of the environment is an externality, not the kind of thing you have in a footnote in economics articles. It's just one of those things that happens when you're trying to maximize utility in transactions. But the public doesn't agree. The United States is somewhat off the spectrum. In policy, the United States is way off the spectrum. Internationally, it's the only country out of over 100 relevant ones that doesn't even have a national policy on emissions or national goals on alternative energy. But the public doesn't agree. The public is quite close to the scientific consensus and the general international consensus, and that's caused serious concerns. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, this group, corporate-funded group that designs legislation for states, and it's pretty effective because of its clout. Koch brothers and all those guys. They have a new program designed to overcome the danger of the public being too rational, paying too much attention to the overwhelming scientific consensus. The program is a K-12 education program to try to introduce what they call balanced teaching into the schools. Balanced teaching means we'll say something about what's agreed by 99% of the scientists in the world, all the national academies of science, every science journal, so we'll mention that. But we have to balance it by talking about climate change denial and how nothing's happening, and if something is happening, humans have nothing to do with it, or maybe as Michelle Bachmann put it, if something's happening, it's God's punishment for homosexuality, or whatever the reason may be. But we have to have balanced teaching in the interest of critical thinking. And that's already been adopted by several states and probably will go on. It's kind of like what's called balanced teaching of evolution theory, along with creation theory, because children have to have open minds. It's necessary to, you may recall that a couple of months ago at the Republican Governors Conference, Bobby Jindal warned the Republicans that they're going to become the stupid party. But ALEC goes beyond. They, and the corporate sector generally, they want it to be the stupid nation to make sure that you don't interfere with what really matters, short-term profit making. Doesn't matter what happens in the longer term. Well, one of the ways to deal with the gaps between public opinion and the goals of dominant power centers is just to ignore the public, as is done pretty successfully when, say, 70% of the public has no influence on policy. And take a look at senatorial decisions. They don't pay any attention to the lower third, maybe little attention to the middle third, quite a lot of attention as you go on up. And of course, about half the population doesn't even vote in presidential elections. You look at the people who don't vote, they tend to be the more poor, overwhelmingly Democrats, and more important than that, social democrats. They want welfare state measures and so on, and jobs, stimulus, and so on. So better for them not to vote. And there are various devices to achieve that. As I'm sure you know, the Republican Party is trying to right now push through all kinds of devices to prevent the rabble from voting. Democrats don't want them to vote either because they have the wrong thoughts. And probably nobody's really studied it. Not a single study as far as I know, but it's probable that people don't vote just because they, without reading the professional literature in political science, they know that what they think just doesn't matter in a plutocracy, so why should they bother? Seems to be what's happening. Well, that's one way to get rid of the rabble, ensure that the men of best quality rule. And another way is to turn to control of the public mind in accord with Hume's Maxim and the various ways it's been implemented over the years, particularly in the free societies and in the United States, in the most freest society, in the most sophisticated forms. And there have been plenty of successes. up to the present moment. Some of them pretty spectacular. But there's always been resistance. It's always a problem to keep the rabble under control. And of course, it's by no means necessary to accept the task that is assigned to the educated classes, the one illustrated by the self-praise of the left liberal intellectuals during World War I, often elsewhere. That's unfortunately the case, that task usually is accepted back to the earliest recorded history, but it's not a law of nature. It's a choice.